Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I have with us the perennially popular Micah Berman. Micah is the person to go to talk about tobacco, and apparently he's one of the lead researchers in the tobacco space from a legal angle. But I'm going to let Micah do his own introduction before we talk about something new that's happening and some of the reports he's been working on. But Micah, first, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, Darshan. So I'm Micah Berman. I'm at Ohio State. I have a joint appointment at the College of Public Health and the law school here. So I teach both on the public health side and the law side. And, as you said, most of my background is on the tobacco side. So I worked pretty much at all levels of government there on local policy, state policy, was at the FDA for a bit, and have been now working more recently with the World Health Organization, a little bit more on the global tobacco regulation side. But I also have a lot of broader interests in the intersection of public health and law generally. So as we talked about last time, co-authored a book about public health law and the idea of transdisciplinary public health law, bringing all different types of expertise to bear on using law to improve health, and working now on another book that's going to take that same framework, but think about legal developments outside of the U.S.
Oh, that's interesting. But before we continue, Micah, I do want to point out that if you are interested in tobacco and you are interested in sort of Micah's thought processes on that, he just recently put out a article called "How History Informs FDA Tobacco Regulation: A Retrospective Application of a Public Health Assessment Framework to Low-Tar Cigarettes." Essentially, I think it is, what if we had the knowledge we did today and we applied it to low-tar cigarettes in the past? Would the FDA still have allowed those cigarettes to come out? Is that a fair assessment, Micah, or do you want to reframe that?
So, yeah, sorry, it's such a long title for you to go through. The idea there is, the FDA on the tobacco side has this sort of unique public health standard where it's supposed to make decisions on whether or not they are appropriate for the protection of public health. And the idea is, we now know that low-tar cigarettes don't actually reduce the harms and likely increase the harms of cigarette use, even though they were promoted as reducing harm. So the question would be, if the FDA were applying this framework and it knew what it knew, or it knew what the tobacco companies knew as of 1990, when these products had already been marketed for a couple of decades, would it have been able to figure out that these low-tar cigarettes were actually not helpful and were in fact causing harm? Because if not, then it sort of raises some fundamental questions about this idea of product regulation and what we're doing with the FDA trying to apply this standard. And so that's the thought process of the article. You can go through it, but I think the reason that I wrote this article was to try to make the broader point that I think, even though FDA has been regulating tobacco products for now almost 15 years, since 2009, I think there's still a lot of sort of fundamental intellectual work to do about what this public health standard means and how it gets applied and what the framework is for applying it. So I threw some of that into the article as well, in the process of doing this sort of historical thought experiment.
Well, thank you very much. And as part of the similar thought process of doing a historical thought experiment, you actually recently worked on a report for the FDA, and that just recently got published. It was in another public health crisis, which really seems true to your brand at this point. But you talk about public health crises from sort of retrospective analyses. But do you want to talk about that while we sort of show the links of where they can access this information?
Sure. So I was really fortunate to be part of this team at Ohio State that brought together experts in law and public health, and one of my colleagues who's at our School of Pharmacy and epidemiology and medicine. And so a great interdisciplinary team that we put together that produced an external review for the FDA about its decision-making on opioids. So you've got the link there. And the idea for this report was there was a 2019 National Academies report that gave a bunch of recommendations to the FDA about how to basically incorporate more of a public health approach into its regulation of opioids. And so this was a follow-up report that we did assessing the FDA's progress towards meeting those recommendations, and then making some further recommendations of our own.
Thank you. And you, just to be clear, you also have your own article on how using opioid settlement proceeds for public health, lessons from the tobacco experience, that you can connect to as well. So that's linked to the bottom as well. But before we talk about what the FDA could have done better, which I think is the thrust of this external review that you just did, maybe we could start from the beginning, because I'll talk about the opioid crisis from the perspective of a pharmacist who kind of, for better or for worse, I was part of it. And I don't like admitting it. It feels wrong. But I remember going through pharmacy school. I remember being told that it's essential that patients' needs for pain be met, that people should not be in pain. Opioids were a tremendous solution to that problem. I mean, you took the opioids and you put them to something, compared them to something like a tramadol, and it wasn't even a comparison. And I remember diabetic foot pain, tooth pain. You always saw these articles saying that these things are incredibly painful. Opioids are a great treatment for this. And this all was great. And then sort of I went into working in hospital practices. So not just retail, but also hospital. You were dealing with people who had like sickle cell, or people who are oncology or cancer pain. And that pain is just through the roof. So in all of those scenarios, opioids were a great answer. However, at the same time, we saw reality was that we were just saying opioids are now bad. And that turn was really quick. Could you talk a little bit about, because you looked at all of this, so talk a little bit about the beginning. Why were opioids such a great idea? When did we realize they're not? And where are we now?
Yeah, so first of all, I'll say in terms of our report, the idea was to be more forward-looking. So it's not about blame or who did something wrong. It's sort of what are the lessons that we can learn from this experience, and
Sure.
What can the FDA take from that? And of course, the lawsuits are about casting blame to some extent. Although the article that I wrote that you mentioned was more about how do we actually take the proceeds from those lawsuits and make sure that they're being used productively, which is something that really didn't happen in the lawsuits that the states brought against the tobacco industry. So how can we sort of learn from that experience and do it better the next time around? So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the issue with opioids is that they are helpful to people who are in pain, and so that part of it is important to remember. It's important to remember now that there are multiple sides to what is going on, and we obviously want to minimize the harm that is caused by opioids, but also not forget that there are people who are in pain. Sometimes it's acute pain in hospital settings, but oftentimes it's chronic pain over time, and we need to figure out what the best things are for treating that type of pain, which is incredibly serious. So the issue with opioids is that there was evidence, as you said, that these products were incredibly helpful, particularly in the more acute settings for treating pretty high levels of pain. The problem was when they were not being used as directed. So the problem was, one, sort of addictiveness, that these products were addictive, and so people continue using them and got addicted to them, and that caused all sorts of problems. For some of these drugs, there was misuse where they were being crushed and then either snorted or dissolved and injected, and so they were being used in ways that they were not intended to be used. So that way they were, able to provide sort of, more of an intense release. And then there was also diversion, where, they were being used by people who had not been prescribed these drugs. And so those became huge issues. And so, and what the lawsuits are a lot about are, the oversupply issues, where there were sort of massive amounts of drugs being shipped. And the idea was that, the companies should have realized that they were sending out far more drugs than there were actually legitimate prescriptions for and legitimate needs for. But that's, at least historically, not an FDA issue. That's not, the FDA's job. So the FDA is, usually making decisions around approval initially, and then, afterwards it's, questions about, well, at the approval point, then there are questions about, okay, what restrictions do you put on these drugs, and if you're approving them, then there's sort of the post-approval oversight questions. Then there's also the marketing piece of it, and the FDA has a limited role historically, but does have a role in reviewing marketing. So those were sort of the FDA intersection points that we looked at.
So I find this fascinating because there are several different points. Let's take a couple of them and play with them a little bit. The first one you talked about was the fact that the products were not used as directed. And there are, you pointed out three, I can think of a fourth one. The first one was the fact that they're addictive, so they were not used as directed in that sense. They got diverted, which was number two, and number three was misused. I'm going to start with the misused one because that's the healthcare practitioner perspective that I'm bringing to the table on that one. Specifically, I'm thinking about the fact that the product got approved for a specific indication in a specific type of pain, and it got used for all other types of pain as well. And we have chastised companies for enabling that in many ways, and that goes to the marketing point you were talking about a few minutes ago. The question I have around that, however, is that is par for the course. I mean, we routinely, most antibiotics get approved for one thing, but they're really used for 100 other indications because you're basing it on the bugs, not the actual indication you actually approved it for. So I can think of pretty much most drugs have an unapproved use, and the FDA recognizes that. In fact, the FDA in one of its articles, as you know, said that might be the standard of care even. What made opioids different in this scenario?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. So one is sort of, as I mentioned, I think sort of the lawsuits are really, laying out the story of, the scope of the aggressive marketing that went along with these products. And, once they were approved, there was this sort of aggressive attempt by some companies to get them, used for all other things, and with at least allegations that they were, factually misleading and underplaying the addiction piece of it, and so forth. So there was, at least arguably, and I mean, at least according to some of the verdicts, wrongful conduct by the manufacturers. Here, the other thing that I didn't mention in that first answer was sort of the intersection with the illicit drug market also. And, you've had, you still have arguments about the degree to which, it was prescription pharmaceuticals that were, the cause of the opioid epidemic in this country. But certainly there are, cases where, the initial use was, a prescribed use, appropriate use. But then, because of addiction, there was the transition to, purchasing, heroin or other, illicit opioids. And, over time that, the heroin market then transitioned into more of a fentanyl market, which became far more deadly. And, so we've had, increasing, overdose deaths over time. as a result of this, illicit market and increasingly deadly illicit market. And so that's, those are other issues. That's an issue that it is also not something that the FDA would typically think about when it is thinking about, approval or marketing decisions, but is really, what has been driving the public health harms over time has increasingly been the illicit market, not prescription opioids. So the question is that something that the FDA should be thinking about, and how does the FDA's decision making intersect with that?
I have so many questions. I'm trying to control each question. Let me start from a basic question, because you mentioned this a few times. You said this is not something that the FDA typically deals with, and you're right. I've thought of the FDA as really a quality organization. Their job is to make sure the product that comes out is two things, that is not two things. It is safe and efficacious. It is not adulterated and misbranded. If you can meet that, the FDA is generally happy. What you're talking about is the public health impact, which I've always thought of as a CDC thing. But let me ask you from the perspective of having today's knowledge and applying it backwards, which luckily you've done, so this works out well. Should the FDA be the one helping in this process, or should it be under the CDC or a different agency?
Yeah, I mean, the CDC for the most part, I mean, there are some exceptions to it, but the CDC for the most part is not a regulatory agency. So the CDC for the most part is assessing what the public health impacts are, and feeding that information hopefully back to the FDA so that it can make decisions accordingly, but it's not taking its own regulatory measures. And here obviously there is other law enforcement pieces and other parts of the federal. I mean, opioids have basically become an issue for almost every part of the federal government. So yeah, I mean, I think what the National Academies report said and what we talked about here was, there are at least some cases, and I think opioids is one of them, where you can think about sort of where it fits. Is it a question of what is safe or a question of what is effective? But somewhere into that process, there should be some consideration of what the effects on the public are, not just when the drug is used as prescribed, but if there is if there is reason to be thinking that there will be other types of harmful uses or diversion or other things like that, that is an appropriate thing for the FDA to be thinking about. But I think there still is more, sort of parallel to the issue on the tobacco side. I think there is more work for the FDA to do, and thinking about, how it actually would do those types of assessments, especially, I mean, it's easier to do after the fact. You have a drug that's been on the market and you can see what the effects are, and you can make a decision. Is it still the case that this drug is safe and effective, or do we need to reconsider that? That's easier when you have the evidence built up. It's harder to think about it prospectively, like what are the types of evidence that the FDA would do. I mean, those aren't the clinical studies that the manufacturers are conducting and submitting to the FDA, so it doesn't necessarily have that type of evidence in front of it when it's making the decision. So what was interesting, when you go through the history, you see the advisory committee members sort of being a little bit stuck in saying, I'm not sure if it's a good idea to be approving another opioid in the middle of a nationwide opioid epidemic, but on the other hand, I'm not sure that that's my job to be thinking about. And my job is really to look and see whether this drug is safe and effective based on the clinical trials. And so, I think the advisory committee members, at least in some cases, kind of weren't sure what their job was in that context. And so, I think those are still, as you said, sort of the opioid example has largely happened. It's not as much of an ongoing issue, but I think the interesting question that we're going to do some more work on as an Ohio State team is to think about, well, what are the other types of contexts in which these same similar concerns might come up.
which is exactly sort of it reminds me of the pharma industry. This is something I'm sure you're familiar with. You do a kappa. When you have a problem, when you have a complaint, you do a root cause analysis, and then you do a corrective action and a preventative action. What I'm hearing you say overall is that we've got the corrective action in place. We've addressed most of the immediate effects. So whether it's prosecuting people, whether it's going after individuals, whether it's helping with the diversion part of it, maybe it's the approvals, all of those have been largely done. Now, I'm sure there are some remaining elements, but for the most part, those are largely done. But there's a second element of the preventative actions, which is what have we learned from this experience that can be applied across the board? And I guess there are some questions that I'd ask about the drug approval process and some across the agency itself. So my first question, theoretically across the agency itself, is should there be what is the impact on public health question that gets asked is my first question. And while you're at it, because I like asking compound questions, does it make sense in retrospect to have always had a REMS before a product with some level of addiction potential comes to the market?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the REMS piece makes sense that, if you're going to approve a product that is addictive or that has, other concerns, then thinking about, all right, how do we think about, the distribution practices or the marketing practices or other things that are going to constrain those negative effects makes sense. I think in some of the opioid cases, the issue is, that, having a REMS is not always sufficient. And so, it still requires, oversight after the fact to make sure that the REMS are doing what they were intended to do, and, paying careful attention there. So, and now I think I lost the other half of your question. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think the second question, if I remember correctly, was should there be a public health impact question that gets asked at the point of approval?
Yeah, so I don't know that that's appropriate in every case, but I think in some cases it probably is. And we sort of raised the question in the report that is over my pay grade of whether that is something that the FDA can do within the scope of its current authority, or whether it would need, at least in some cases, to go back to Congress and ask for that authority. There's been some additional changes in authority on the opioid part, so that the FDA might be able to do that with opioids. But for other types of drugs, it might actually, that would be a legal question of whether those are questions that it can consider. But I think it is, at least in some cases, appropriate, where the FDA, I think appropriately does consider itself to be a public health agency. It is, approving these products, because it thinks that having them available, at least, for the people who need them, will be positive for public health. And if, part of that assessment should be, well, if the, negative effects are so intense that it's going to be a net negative, then, that would seem to be appropriate for it to be considering. And, here, you can argue about who is right or wrong, but it was, it caused some outrage, from members of Congress, from state AGs and others, why, where, they were sort of up in arms. Why do you keep approving new opioids when we on the ground in the States are, trying to deal with this opioid crisis? And so, you saw this shift over time where the FDA essentially, started to agree and said, actually, these are considerations that we should be taking into account. But then the question, following from that is how to do that. And it's not, as I said, it's not the information that the FDA is being provided with. So, part of what the FDA has done in response is provide support to do some of its own, or to do some of it internally, but also provide support to academic institutions to do modeling of, if we make these new products available, what are the potential public health effects. So, having that be not something that the manufacturer is necessarily responsible for doing, but having other means of evidence generation so that it can actually look at those questions. And, for me, sort of building on what we talked about last time about the transdisciplinary piece, I think part of, advisory committees need to have the evidence to look at, but they also need to have the right people in the room. And so if you're going to ask questions about what the public health effect is, then you need to have people in the room who are public health experts, who can think about the issue from that perspective. And those people are not, I think, typically on the advisory committees that are looking at drug approval questions.
I could literally ask more questions for the next 2 hours without even blinking an eye. But I'm going to ask one question, and Micah, we're just going to have you back and do this a little bit more methodically, because I felt like every answer you gave had more questions that opened up. If I was a pharma company and I have a potential treatment for pain, what are the lessons based on what you've seen, whether it's the litigation, whether it's the approval process? Let's say I'm a good actor and I'm trying to do good. And I like to believe most people are, but let's say that's, and I think that going to something is often a slippery slope more than you're just evil and trying to do evil things. But let's assume that you're a good actor, you're trying to do good. What are steps you need to be taking that would enable a pain treatment to come to market in a way that is not just safe and efficacious, but in the public good?
Yeah, so part of it is about, it depends on obviously the product and its characteristics and addictiveness and so forth.
Yeah.
So, part of it is about the product. And so, there's also the question about how you, if tampering with a product is going to be a problem, like how do you make those products tamper proof? And in the opioids case, you had this weird dynamic where, because the products had already been available and people were addicted to them, when you made it harder for them to be tampered with, that arguably led to people going to the illicit market and causing more harm. But, that would not have been as much of an issue had those issues been addressed at the outset, and had these products been actually made to be tamper proof or to a higher degree when it started. So that's part of it. So limiting misuse is partly about the product, and so that's the part that is sort of most within the control of the actual manufacturer. The oversupply diversion issues sort of come along later with other actors getting involved. So that's less within their control, arguably. But the product itself is something that can actually be controlled. And then as you said, like thinking about the REMS piece and what actually are the appropriate controls to put in place. And there's two sides of that. As you started with, you want people who have need for the product to actually be able to get it. So some of the realms, there's debate over whether they went too far and required administrative steps and certification steps that weren't actually doing anything for public health, but were just creating barriers so that it was harder to actually prescribe these drugs. So thinking thoughtfully about what those restrictions are and having a conversation with the FDA about what those appropriate restrictions are and which ones actually are helpful, as opposed to just being an additional administrative burden. I think those are really important conversations to be having at the outset. And then I think if you're going to be making decisions about public health, like what is the manufacturer's role and sort of the evidence generation there, and is there an appropriate role for the manufacturer to be playing, even if it's outside of what is normally done?
I think that's awesome. I also want to say that this is, to your point you were making earlier, this is the value of having different experts from different fields come have a conversation. Because my head, I was going, because I feel like I was almost personally affected by it, the idea that the marketing needed to be controlled, the kickbacks needed to be controlled, that distribution. You mentioned distribution, but it's different sensitivities will bring different pieces to bear and different sort of points to be raised. So each one of the things we talked about could by itself be an episode, because it sounds like there's so much there to explore. I hope you'll consider coming back, and we can have a conversation about some of these individual pieces and how they play out from a public health perspective, and how the FDA might have a role in it, but it's not the sole agency that would necessarily govern.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think I've on the tobacco side, on the opioid side, like I think this is just sort of getting the conversation started and suggesting that I think we do need a wider range of expertise here. And I left that out of my answer, but I certainly agree on the advertising and marketing piece too. Like that is one where on the opioid side, like it's largely gone. There you don't really see that type of advertising from opioid producers anymore, but it certainly was an issue in the past.
Yeah. And I wasn't suggesting that you didn't think it was important. It was just more top of mind for me, was the point I was making. Only because I work in that space, but that's it. Micah, thank you again, as always, for coming on. This was amazing. And for those people who want to read more about what Micah's put out, today's news is this article came out. Is that today, or is it just this week?
Yeah, actually, just this morning, I think. Yeah.
How history informs the FDA tobacco regulation, a retrospective application of a public health assessment from the low-tar cigarettes, and there's a bit.ly link you can look at. And just remember, you could also see his article, the part that he participated in for the FDA itself, and his article on the opioid settlement for public health, lessons from the tobacco experience. So, Micah, thank you again for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks.